So in this video, we are going to be making a tier list, but of course, before we start that, I need to define how we are ranking these things, because I think all the classes can be at least good. So this means that I'm not going to include options below C, and I have listed off what each tier means. Note, it never goes down to can never be great. In the right composition, all classes can shine, just some can do that more easily than others. And I'm going to be talking about this in reference to Pathfinder Society, which is a drop-in game, so you don't necessarily know who you're going to be playing with. And I'm also assuming that you are playing your class well. Maybe not perfectly, but you know all of your mechanics, and if there's a learning curve to the class, you've gotten over it by now. That is where I'm writing this tier list from. So, in a Pathfinder Society game, they do tend to have a few difficult combats, a couple skill challenges, and a core theme. You would get to prepare spells, do any of your daily preparation stuff at the start of the session, and you'd probably already know the theme at that point. So due to that, prepared and spontaneous casters will be rated about equally. And yeah, I think we can just get into it, because I think going into Alchemist will have me further explain different ideas. I'm going to put Alchemist in the sometimes great to usually great tier, depending on what type of Alchemist you are. And I'm going to be generous with which subclass you are picking, because I think that Alchemist, if you're playing Chirurgeon, the medical-based one, where it lets you use crafting in place of medicine for every skill check, create healing items easily, I think that that type of Alchemist is going to put in a lot of work. However, I think that stuff like the Poisoner, that relies on you having something like Investigator or a Ranger or somebody that's using some kind of projectile weapon, so you can then poison their bullets or arrows or shurikens or whatever, and have them apply poisons for you as well as do other stuff. That relies on a lot of team synergy, but generally the Medical Alchemist will just be a pretty good healer that carries around the damage type variety that they need. Crafting is a skill that can recall knowledge. They can carry on the other skills as an int character. So I think that if I had an Alchemist in my Pathfinder Society game, I would not be upset. Now, moving into Barbarian, they're just kind of damage-dealing meat sticks, and I think that a lot of people will be playing damage-dealing meat sticks. And another thing about drop-in games is the more popular a class is, the worse it gets, because the more popular a certain playstyle is, the better it becomes to do anything else to fill a different niche. So because Barbarian is a simple hit stick in combat, it's still going to be great most of the time, but it's going to be at like the bottom of A tier, pretty much always. Just because there are a lot of hit stick classes, and I think those will all be decently popular. A lot of classes can do damage, so it isn't the type of thing of a Barbarian is going to be a great fit in every single party, because you get a party of Barbarian, Fighter, Ranger with one healer. Maybe the Barbarian would have been better as something else. And so I'm going to rate pure meat stick hitting classes a bit lower than some might expect, simply for that reason. In terms of utility, Barbarian really doesn't drag that much in aside from its skills, and I'd say that if you're not planning on doing athletics maneuvers a lot, you should, on your Barbarians, on your Fighters, etc., leave your athletics kinda at that trained expert level, and upgrade other utility skills, so that way when a skill challenge does come up, you're not just sitting there twiddling your thumbs. Because that is a thing that I see a lot of newer player characters fall into. I think that people should generally be going into skills that are a little more offbeat, simply because when you are assembling a party, being able to cover a bunch of roles is important. And so, I just kind of line up with, what stats do I generally have? Could I fit in a skill here? Could I fill in this niche a little bit? Because it gives you another shot at making some of these nature checks that might be required or whatever else. So I think that generally picking things that are a little bit unconventional is actually a strength, because it means that you're less likely to be doubling up on people trying to do specific things. So Bard is going to be in S tier. I was thinking about putting an A, but no. If I ever see a Bard in my party and they have signature spell Soothe and they are willing to do their compositions that are the main point of their class, well, it's an area buff. If I have a group of 4 or 5 people in Pathfinder Society game, yeah, Bard is going to put in work. And he'll carry the charisma skills of a lot of different varieties for all the stuff that requires those. So yeah, Bard is going to be great. And if a Bard is playing well, and they have a spell list with variety, they're the one that's going to be shutting off reactions with Laughing Fit. They're the one that is going to be revealing the invisible creatures with Revealing Light. And they're going to be carrying a lot of these utility spells alongside their Soothe, and just being a great support. And so Bard is going to be our first class making its way into S tier. Even if I had a lot of casters in the party, well, actually, a lot of casters in the party does make Bard not as great. So I'm going to put down A tier. Because if I had a, let's say, 3 caster and a fighter party, well, one of those other casters could probably set up Bless anyway. There are going to be a lot of redundancy in the debuffs and buffing game, and I don't think Bard really has the juice in order to branch out aside from just the casting role. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. Cleric, I think, is actually S tier. Specifically, War Priest Cleric, which is going to surprise a lot of people, because War Priest Cleric can basically do everything, just not all at once. It is a healer, it is a buffer, it is a debuffer, it has access to area damage. Yeah, it's not going to be as efficient at area damage as like the wizards or the sorcerers or the psychics or any of that stuff, but you have area damage. Yeah, you might be at -2 for a few of the levels of the game, but like, it's perfectly fine to still launch out an area damage spell to soften up a bunch of crowds. You have enough heals to basically be a mono healer in an adventuring party that happens to be low on healing, and you play a healer with good defenses. Alternatively, if you have a group with a lot of casters, you are then playing a martial with self-sustain from healing, and that can fill in that gap. And so the only weakness of Cleric is you don't have a lot of skill variety, but that is something that you can overcome because a lot of these modules are written in such a way that any random pickup group will be able to beat them, maybe just not easily. But the thing with Cleric is it is such a powerful class, not easily means easily for a Cleric. So with that, Cleric is getting its way into being our first true S tier. Now, if you were to build your Bard as a Gish, and go into like champion archetype to get heavier armors and do the strength stuff, then yeah, it might also go into S tier, but I don't think that's like the optimal way to play a Bard. So again, a lot of this stuff is opinion oriented and depends on the types of groups you are expecting to have. Because if you're expecting to be paired with only martials, because your local meta includes a lot of martials, because if you're playing Pathfinder Society, what matters is who do you frequently play with, and if they like to play a lot of warrior characters, Bard will be an S tier class for you. If they like to play a lot of mages, well then Bard drops down to B tier. So you can decide for yourself which one of those scenarios is most likely. Champion? Champion goes really well in a squishier party as the main protector and a character that can output damage if you have those two-handed weapons and you're playing something like a Justice champion. Alternatively, it can be a debuffer that exceeds all others and is still tanking and is helping your out-of-combat healing. It's going to be usually great. I cannot think of a party where I am upset to have a champion, but I can think of some times where the champion is just kind of falling a little bit behind, because you are still reliant on, I need to be protecting my allies, I want to be having these tight close quarters fights, and champion outside of that, I'd say that a lot of champion's power is in either Lay on Hands, which is a healing focus spell, their armor proficiency scaling up quickly so that they become a tank, and their champion reaction. And with that plus basic martial damage, they're going to be usually great. In some comps, you will want somebody to actually do more damage than champion. But again, I'm never upset if I see a champion in the party. It's just that I think there are few adventures where they're rising up to that exceptional tier, where clerics very easily rise to that exceptional tier every single time there's an adventure with a bunch of undead, which is very common. Champions would rise to that above tier if they're fighting a bunch of fiends, bunch of demons, things that are weak to holy, because champions can have their strikes also get the holy trait from sanctification. And you're not allowed to play an unholy champion in Pathfinder Society. So if you're playing Inventor where you're fighting a lot of fiends, champion becomes exceptional. But I don't think that's too common in PFS, where I think that a lot of adventures include a lot of undead, and Cleric becomes absolutely absurd in those. So Druid is again going to go with, like, it's a caster, you can play caster well, and has medium armor, so you can play frontline, you can be a party bulk tank. I'm going to put it at, like, the bottom of A tier, top of B tier. I think top of B tier is probably the most accurate. But you do have stuff like Slow, you have stuff like Electric Arc, you have Fireball, you have Heal. You have very, very good spells. You have enough bulk to be able to survive basically on your own a lot of the time. But I think that, especially with stuff like Primal Sorcerer being a thing, and Sorcerer now having that extra damage and extra healing, Druid is now looking at being a wisdom-oriented character with more bulk that heals. And so, like, again, it's like between these two, it doesn't have the exceptional ability to tap into this massive pool of extra healing and getting weapon proficiencies to be an off-martial like War Priest can. But generally, Druid's class chassis is pretty solid. Animal Companions can put in work. A bunch of lightning focus spells can put in work. Druid will do good stuff. It's usually a pretty good thing to have in your party. A competently played caster is always a nice fit. Likewise, a competently played fighter is a good fit. However, something I noticed about fighter players is they tend to go straight athletics, intimidation, ignore every other skill in the game. Don't do that. But in all honesty, if you're playing fighter and you're actually getting skill variety, and you're doing something like investing in intelligence to get extra skills, because you really only need strength to be a functional character, you can have fighter be pretty great. Its only real weakness is that you're gonna have issues in those skill challenges if you aren't actively thinking about, ooh, there are parts of this game that aren't pure fighting. Same issue that Barbarian has. Because when I think of the fighter, I'm thinking like people are going to bring their melee fighters, their polearms and etc. I think polearm fighters are great. It's just that I want fighter players to consider their out of combat and what they do there. Clerics get a little bump in the out of combat sections because, well, they have all the spells that are common on the Divine list, which is quite a lot. So casters will generally be stronger in the utility game. Casters will also have a mental stat be their key ability score, so they tend to help their team's skill variety, where a lot of characters will happen to have athletics trained to master, so having high strength and athletics is not really a unique feature, and having too many athletics characters will hinder your ability to do these skill challenges. But in any case, let's move on to Gunslinger, which I'm going to put down in C tier. B tier if you are using an Arbalist, but if you're playing a Gunslinger, it's probably because you want to use a gun. Let's be honest here, I know Arbalist exists, I know some people are going to say, but I'm playing an Arbalist Gunslinger. No. Most people are playing Gunslinger to use guns. And the issue with guns is they have the Fatal trait. And the Fatal trait means that you really want to be doing team buffs. And if you don't get a party that is kind of warping their play to give you bonuses, if you don't have somebody going in for the grapples and the trips, if you don't have somebody giving you that status bonus to hit, you really aren't going to be critting that much, and thus you're going to be an underwhelming damage character. In terms of skill variety, you're not doing anything exceptional compared to other dexterity characters, and I don't think the dexterity skills are usually that called upon. So, thus I'm going to put Gunslinger down in like that C tier. Again, jumps up to B if you're using an Arbalist or other non-fatal weapon. And also I think the splash weapons are not that exceptional as well, because you're going to be hitting your allies a lot of the time, because I think that Fighter, Barbarian are some of the more popular classes. Things that get into melee and hit stuff, so you'd be hitting your own teammates. And Splash can also destabilize people that are knocked out and give them failed death saves. So that's an issue. I do think Gunslinger can still be great if you have the party synergy to go with it. I think that Gunslinger with party synergy goes up to being a really strong class, but in a Pathfinder Society game, you cannot rely on that team synergy. And so Inventor is going to go into B tier for its numbers being small for combats, truly. It wants to be a utility character that has a lot of different tools, but it has a lot of class power put into Overdrive, which is like Barbarian Rage, but now it still costs actions to use, unlike post-remaster Barbarian. Takes actions to use, requires a skill check to get into, like pre-remaster Swashbuckler, that you need to succeed on, and its reward isn't that high afterward. So as such, Inventor, it's fine. And it does have area damage, it does have some elemental damage, it has a lot of good traits, and that's why sometimes it's great. It fills the party niche that you need it to, but I think that its numbers are just a little bit too small. And the reason it avoids C tier for the small number issues that Gunslinger has is Inventor gets to have crafting automatically progress up to Legendary, so they are a 4-skill class, which means that they are bringing more skill variety than the other class in C tier. They can bring consistent healing outside of the medicine skill via a level 2 class feat that lets you explode healing onto people. And that leads to Inventors having a niche in a lot of parties. It's just that I'd say that usually in a lot of parties, they'd feel overshadowed by the fighters, the barbarians, and then really only get their time to shine during that skill challenge. But Inventor can still put in a ton of work. There really isn't a huge gap between any of these tiers. All are useful, just they aren't exceptional, except for in those scenarios where they're good. This tier list is rating how often they are exceptional. And so Investigator, I'm actually going to put an A tier. Because you have the Forensic Investigator that you can combine with the Medic archetype to then be a healer that is on par with Cleric. Your damage won't be as good as it should be for like a martial character, but you have a ton of skill variety, so I'm going to put Investigator actually at top of A tier now. Because with how Pathfinder Society scenarios are set up, and with how adventure paths are set up, you kind of know what your goal is, and so for Investigator, it's very easy for them to be playing their minigame and be asking the right questions to follow leads. And so they're going to go pick what lead they want to follow, and if the creature that they're fighting they think can answer questions or get them closer to finding that answer, Investigator will just kinda do that really efficiently, because they get that bonus to all those checks, and they can even give that bonus to allies out of combat via the reaction clue in. So, Investigator will be really, really good in all the skill challenges, just flat out exceptional at the skill challenges, and during combat, if it has the free action ability to shoot, it's going to be a great time for it. But if it doesn't get that free action ability to devise a stratagem, it is going to be significantly worse than the other martials in terms of its output, and then you're just kind of being a weirder version of a healer that requires melee, usually has a ranged weapon, and it's kind of awkward in that regard. But Investigator will absolutely put in work in average game, and it usually can hit that exceptional mark at least once a session. So that's why I'm putting it top of A. It's not quite S because it does have that mild consistency issue with whether or not it gets to free action devise a stratagem. And so with Kineticist, this is again bottom of A, top of B, simply because it has a harder time in those skill challenges. But Kineticist does fill the role of, hey, what if we need area damage? Hey, what if we need a little bit of healing? And you can kind of build Kineticist to do a lot of different things, play the off martial. It's generally going to always be good, and always being good is pretty damn good. It also, if there's a time where there's a bunch of enemies, oh, the Kineticist is shining. The only time Kineticist is really actively weaker than other classes is when it is doing a single target boss fight, because Kineticist does not have the crowd control of a normal caster, nor does it have the single target damage output of a full martial. So it really only struggles in those solo boss fights, but you can kind of mitigate that by going into athletics and tripping, grappling, etc. You can mitigate that by going to medicine, having battle medicine, and playing a healer during those fights that has decent range damage. There are ways to make Kineticist function even in those fights, and on average, they are great at just dealing with all the mooks, dealing with all the other fights. But if you are getting into the medicine and athletics, you're not going to be doing that much in skill challenges. So there are going to be times where you are not as good as other classes in that type of scenario. But this is also because Pathfinder Society scenarios tend to be a full adventuring day that is played in 2 to 4 hours, roughly. And as such, there isn't a lot of time for casters to have to burn through other high-level slots. So casters are going to be at full power, and so Kineticist's ability to last through a longer adventuring day doesn't come up as often, due to the way a lot of those Pathfinder scenarios are really set up. If there were longer adventuring days, Kineticist would really kind of be closer to here. But because adventuring days in Pathfinder Society tend to be shorter due to the Society scenarios being short one-shot adventures, I think that Kineticist hangs out in B tier. But again, this does not mean Kineticist is a bad class. You can build a Kineticist and put in work every session, and you can even do stuff into those boss fights. You're just going to have consistency issues when it comes to those boss fights or the skill challenges, where other classes in the upper tiers don't need to make a compromise like that. Because Druids can bring in their slows, deal with bosses, and invest in a bunch of wisdom skills to be good in those challenges. Constitution is used for exactly 0 different skills, so Kineticist is the worst class at skill challenges, on average. Magus. I really like Magus, and I'm going to put it probably top of B or bottom of A. It is an intelligence character, so you are likely to cover a lot of the int skills. Int is one of the most common key ability scores in the game, so I also don't think the int class are going to be that popular, but that is going to be a thing. Magus is a half, well, not, I wouldn't even call it half caster. I'd say they're a martial with spell slots that can use staves, use scrolls, etc. So if you are a Magus, you can try and prep the exact spells that you need to beat an encounter, but you're really limited in the amount of slots you have. So your thing will be like burst damage at the start of a fight in single target, which is perfectly fine, doable. But I don't think it's much to write home about when you're comparing it to Fighter Barbarian, especially post-remaster Barbarian, that just runs in there and has massive hits every single turn. So I think that you really need to evaluate Magus as how valuable is 5 cantrips and a few slots on a caster, or on a martial class chassis. I'd say that's pretty valuable. But I think that a lot of Magus players will get very hyper-focused into Spell Strike. I mean, trying to make Spell Strike super, super good, and ignoring that, yeah, you can still bring slow, you can still bring haste, you can still bring enlarge, you can bring these things that you would normally need a full caster for, and because you are preparing spells at the start of the adventuring day, I'm going to put it slightly ahead of Barbarian Fighter despite not having the same consistent damage output, simply because you have the option to cover the types of stuff that you'd normally need a arcane caster to do. And cover all your damage type variety that you need. It can cover needing to have a specific boss killing tool like slow, and it can do all this without being too fragile, and while still having a basic martial level of damage. So as such, I think that Magus is a very useful class, and I'd never be upset to see a Magus in my party, unless I already had the Fighter Barbarian, everything else, and it was like an all-martial party and Magus is our one caster. That's the only time I'd really be upset about it. Magus can't really heal, which is going to keep it down from the higher classes, because these can at least cover the healer role somewhat. And so Magus is just kind of be here. Actually, I think I'm going to do a tier split. Add a row below. A-, usually great, but no healing. And then I'm just going to have that be the tier split. And this is going to mean Druid is up into usually great because it can cover more team roles. This feels about right to me. This feels more correct. I will adjust stuff at the end probably as well. So, we are now looking at Monk. And so, the thing to note about Monk is it is, in terms of its class chassis, highly defensive. It gets to cheat out actions with Flurry of Blows, but how valuable are those cheated actions? And usually monks struggle to fill up what they're doing. And so my answer to those monk players is invest in skills, invest in battle medicine, invest in the ability to recall knowledge, use aid, and there are a bunch of ways you can fill those. And I think that a good monk player is actually healing with battle medicine. They should be playing this off healer role. And so I'm going to put them at top A- tier because they don't have really good healing, but I think that they should be getting into battle medicine. I think they should be using aid. And I think that if they are doing that, they're doing decent damage, are hard to take down, are going to be annoying for enemies to move around with stuff like stand still being an option for them, with things like athletics maneuvers being an option for them. And so I think that monk will be pretty good in most party scenarios. If you have battle medicine, that jumps up to just about every party scenario, but then you're struggling in skill challenges if you are investing in that athletics and medicine, so you're kind of having similar issues that Kineticist was having, but strength and dex have some skills tied to them. Medicine is fine. Aiding lets you have more utility than Kineticist normally has, because Kineticist is usually action starved, blah, 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 blah. Again, these tiers are closer together than I'm making them sound. All classes can function well. So Oracle, I'm going to just plop it at top of A tier. Oracle, with its curse-bound actions, is very potent. It is a 4-slot caster for some reason. It has armor, so it can survive some time when left alone on the battlefield. And it just puts in the work that you need it to. As a divine caster, it has all the good buffs, has some amount of good area damage. It kind of does what War Priest does, but doesn't need to sacrifice casting bonuses to get into that armor. You can just take one general feat to get into the medium armor. And because it's a charisma caster, you also have access to stuff like champion dedication. So if you want to play a frontline tanky Oracle, you can. Oracle really won't have the option to splash into damage like a War Priest can. So it will not have that same, I can be the off-martial damage per round that Cleric can, but it gets really close. So it's going to be top of A tier because it can heal, it can buff, it can apply the necessary debuffs you need, such as removing reactions, making enemies dazzled, revealing people from invisibility. It has area damage from different spells. Different Oracle subclasses will give you granted spells as well, so you get more than just the base divine list, much like Cleric. Yeah. Oracle puts in a ton of work. Honestly, there's an argument for it being an S tier, particularly some of its curse-bound actions that both heal, do damage, and let it output a ton of value in individual fights. I think Oracle being an S tier feels right to me, but there is also the argument for it to be at top of A rather than bottom of S. Because, I think S tier should be things that are so good they're, almost balance concerns, which means Oracle is going to be there. So going into Psychic, I'm going to drop it down to C tier, because Psychic needs a good amount of resources to protecting it, being a 6 HP cloth caster, much like Sorcerer, Witch, and Wizard, who are all at the end of the alphabet. So we haven't talked about them yet. But as a penance for being a squishier character, it also has fewer slots. But its bonus is it gets extra damage on some of its spells due to it having Unleash Psyche, which will let it add double spell level on any of its no duration damage spells that it casts. Which is fine. It's a pretty powerful ability, but if you want to have area damage, Druid, even Alchemist with its bombs, Kineticist, Inventor kind of with its explosions, can all do a little bit, and as the game has aged, more and more classes, as they get introduced, have magical utility. Because there is no way to number power creep Fighter and Barbarian. They have no interest in number power creeping them, so classes are getting interesting area abilities as ways to represent damage in a way that isn't straightforward I hit them. So as the game has aged, more and more classes have area damage. More and more classes have extra utility, and Psychic, its gimmick being I have the biggest, baddest area damage, now isn't as needed because you just have 2 classes doing good area damage, and you don't really need to have the squishy thing on your team. And I can't even do my normal arguments about casters because its slots are so limited that it can actually run out of its upper level slots in these shorter adventuring days. And so when it comes to Psychic, I'm going to put down rarely great, but if you do have those short adventuring days, you do have a party that is capable of protecting you, or you can stand back, not get ambushed. You can put in a ton of work with your amped cantrips under your Unleashed Psyche and get a ton of value. But I think that it is more work to get that value out, and I think that other classes can also fill that niche. This does not mean Psychic is useless, to be very clear on that, because somebody's going to say that I'm hating on Psychic for no reason. I am saying that I'd probably rather have one of these casters on my party over a Psychic, because Psychic will not really be bringing the utility that I'd want from a caster slot. And if I wanted just area damage without the extra utility, I'd rather have Kineticist. And I already rated Kineticist pretty low, so I think that Psychic still needs to get the stuff that is utility. It's just that they have a harder time utilizing that utility because they have fewer slots to make up for their extra damage, which I don't think matters that much. So Psychic is just kind of an unfortunate spot in the meta due to how I think new classes have come in. I think that as Magus players start prepping area damage, Psychic will fall down to this level, but if your local meta has poor area damage, doesn't really have a lot of casters, people will love to have you around. That being said, I think I'd love to have these other casters more. Editor Jump Scare. So you can build a party that has every class as the correct answer for who should our final member be. That's not up for debate. You can absolutely find a use for where this class is the best one for this group. I'm just saying that Psychic is a little bit more pigeonholed than other casters, and it has weaknesses that you do need to make up for somehow. So as such, I think that it's worse when you're looking at pickup games specifically. That's it. So that is why it is down C tier. Not unplayable, just I think I'd rather have specific other characters in my party instead. And if I had a party built around Psychic and that was part of the team comp, it would put in a ton of work. So Ranger, I'm going to put with the other hitting marshals. If you're doing the dual wield thing, I think that you should be tossing in trips and grapples with the reduced multi-attack penalty. If you're doing the bow thing, that's a pretty good way to pressure people to come out to you. You have a decent amount of skill variety. Ranger's pretty good. But I don't have much more to say on Ranger that aren't covered by the other 2 hitting things character. I think it's a bit worse in damage, but has other utility abilities it can pick up that are maybe a bit stronger than these other 2. So I'm just going to kind of lump these 3 together, as they're your classic hitting marshals. With Rogue, I'm going to put next to Investigator because I think it wins a lot of the skill challenges single-handedly. And now, if you are playing a range Rogue, this does require a bit more team synergy. It requires you to be like a Mastermind Rogue, really go down the list of all lore skills, be ready to recall knowledge a ton. And recall knowledge isn't as good in a game with randoms. And it's not just because, oh, well, the randoms may not have their characters built in such a way that they can utilize the knowledge that you find, which is part of it, but it's also, randoms aren't likely to always want to follow orders from the table about what is optimal after knowledge gets revealed. So you could recall knowledge, learn that reflex is a weaker save, but then somebody's still going to try and grapple the boss because they think it's cool, which is a perfectly fair way to play, and I encourage you to do stuff like that if that's the type of table you want, but that also makes recall knowledge less valuable at those types of tables. So range rogues would be down here in C tier, to be clear, for Pathfinder Society. If you have a grapple in your party, range rogue also is hanging out in A tier. I'd love it to have my party is usually great. Range rogue is very specific, but melee rogues, flanking is easy. And you have a ton of skills. So you sweep the skills section of the game, you can be a healer with battle medicine, and you still have 5 more skills to play with, so you're gonna have a great time. And the Rogue and Investigator are similarly in 80% of games they'll be great. Investigator's limiting factor is, do I get my free action device of stratagems? Rogue's limiting factor is, do I have somebody to reliably flank with? because that may not always be true. I think that the meat stick classes are some of the most popular ones, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're guaranteed to have one. If you were guaranteed to have one, I'd be putting Rogue in S tier, but that is not a guarantee. So I'm going to keep Rogue down in this A tier mark, because you cannot always rely on having that team synergy, even though the team synergy is just, I want to have a beefcake wall that doesn't feel pain, which is decently common, but not a guarantee. Sorcerer, I think, is one of the better casters in PFS. I'm going to put it right below Investigator and Rogue because, again, winning skill challenges is such a big deal. But Sorcerer, being an extra slot caster, means you have a lot of value that way. It gets to have extra damage, half of the extra damage that Psychic would get from its spell slots, which, sure, and also applies the healing that you do from things like heal. So 3-action heal is super potent from a Sorcerer if they're primal or divine. And there really isn't anything you do with a Sorcerer that is super wrong other than pick bad spells. But if you're picking decent to good spells, and you know how to play caster well, Sorcerer is gonna usually be a great addition to any party in that castery role. But if you have a party full of a bunch of casters, it cannot flex into doing anything else, so I'm actually gonna drop it a little bit behind Bard due to that 6 HP, making it more specific in terms of what comps it is actually excelling in. Because I'd rather have a Bard in a caster-heavy party, just because Bard is less likely to fold to the first bit of pressure. Because 8 HP in light armor versus 6 HP in no armor. Now looking at Summoner. Summoner is another pretty good all-rounder class. So I'm going to put it next to Alchemist, just kind of like in this range. Because you do have some weird action constraints in terms of how you are commanding your Eidolon around. And you are limited in what slots you have. So it's kind of similar issues to what Magus is having. But I think that Summoner players are... And Summoner as a class does encourage you to still get variety. You can be something like the Fey Eidolon, have extra spell slots from that. And generally, I'd say that Summoners can put in a good amount of work, because Eidolon will be a thing for the Rogue to flank with while you are putting up buffs on the main character. You can throw out slow and 2 attacks at full martial accuracy, which alone makes it a pretty high tier class. And Summoner can also have the area damage if you need that. It isn't a prepared caster, unlike Magus, which actually is a downside for the 4-slot characters because you're not really casting any spell twice anyway. But as a spontaneous character, you can just put heal in one of those slots, then you have 4 potential slots of healing. And you put 1 area damage spell in, slow and fireball, whatever, if you're a primal sorcerer, and that's just going to be pretty good. And that's kind of how I describe Summoner. Does a lot of things pretty good. I don't think it ever hits that exceptional tier that Cleric and Oracle can. But I think it earns its A tier spot, and it can have healing. So, yeah. Swashbuckler? I'm going to put it right behind Rogue. Because it doesn't really require the things that Rogue Investigator does. It works basically every time now in the remaster, where you're going to get temporary panache at least. You're going to be able to move around the battlefield, you're going to have 10 HP for the sake of tanking, you are going to be generally useful, you have an extra skill, so you have 4 skills relative to most people's 3, and you're just kind of be a hitting stuff martial, actually, but doesn't have healing. I'm going to drop it down here. You can go for stuff like Battle Medicine, but it doesn't naturally fit into your kit as well as even Monk, so I'm going to definitely put it down here. Because there are some party comps where you just kind of feel, I would have rather had something with a bit more healing in the slot. But generally, if we have at least 1 healer, I'm very happy to see a Swashbuckler, because usually they will carry some useful skills around with them. And yeah, I think a lot of Swashbucklers will be taking Acrobat Dedication, boosting whatever their skill is with their extra skill increase that they get, and then having 3 more skills after that. I mean, that's going to solve a lot of skill challenges. But again, it has a much harder time healing than I'd say even Rogue Investigator, because Rogue can still get Battle Medicine. And I think that Rogue is more likely to have Open Hand and be investing into Medicine just because they have so many extra skill feats that I think getting Battle Medicine is pretty free on a Rogue. So, it depends on exact builds. Like, everything in this kind of blob is all debatable of where it should be. Thaumaturge, I'm going to put bottom of A tier because with Chalice you actually do have a decent amount of healing. It does have Recall Knowledge on any topic, which brings it up a bit. But again, Recall Knowledge isn't that useful if people aren't changing their play around it, which is pretty common in pickup groups. So, it's a hit stuff marshal with extra utility. Will have 4 skills brought up, one of which will be a magical recall knowledge skill, which are usually pretty decently high in demand. But its key ability score will be charisma, so it's gonna have a low mental stat going with that skill. I'm gonna put it at bottom of this A tier because it has the Chalice to be an off healer, if it so chose. But I don't think the Chalice is the most common choice. I'll put it at top of A minus. I have no idea. It depends on a lot of other things. But I could see having a Thaumaturge in a party that is like Rogue, Barbarian, Fighter, and going, well, I would have rather had a healer, and then you being sad about it. Or if we have Rogue, Barbarian, Fighter, Summoner with heal, I think we're thinking, okay, we can do this. And you're cracking your knuckles. With Witch, so a lot of people are going to expect me to say Resentment Witch is so strong, but Resentment Witch kind of needs some team synergy to get up its debuffs in an efficient manner. And it does need that protection. But, you know, you can prepare spells based on the theme, but, you know, you only have limited use of that because you're prepared. And so Witch, I'm going to kind of put it in, I think, top of B tier. Simply because needing to protect the familiar or the Witch itself is going to be a struggle for parties that don't have a champion in them. And it does require, like, action maneuvering around the familiars. You can set up your spells and cackle them to get value out of them, but I think that Witch in general will be doing work, but I'm not entirely convinced that I'd look at an average party and go, yes, this Witch is going to be the thing that carries us to the victory, where I could easily say that about Cleric, Oracle, and most of these classes in the middle here. I don't think Witch ever hits that carry role without team synergy and people kind of building around what the familiar is trying to do. Wizard, I will put in the middle of the A minus tier because I think having extra slots of spells that you are choosing is that good. It has the ability to recover one of its slots midday, which is incredibly potent. Because if you're recovering a slot that you've already expended as a prepared caster, you're basically getting the advantageous nature of being spontaneous, which is if you need a second fireball in day, you can just do that. Wizard can also just do that. And it lets you prepare your spells based on what adventure is coming. And again, this list is assuming you're playing well. So I'm assuming that you're making your spell book and preparing spells based on what you think will be coming next. And you could be playing spell substitution if you expect to be playing longer APs, where you have these longer venturing days between resting, so you can swap out your spells based on what would be most efficient, what you used. Or you could be planning to know you're playing in a lot of society one-shots, where you just burn through all your resources in one venturing day, and you then destroy your lower rank slots to make more higher rank slots and have value that way. Still not a healer, so it's going to A minus tier. It does need a little bit of that protection, but with Wizard, I think you can stay far enough away that you don't need that much protection. And having extra slots is a big enough deal to where I think it's going to help a lot. So yeah, that will be my list. Let me know your thoughts about this in the comments down below. You can go ahead and take your screenshots now. I'll wait. Anyway, I'm done waiting. So, if you like this video, subscribe for the next one. I'll probably not make a low effort tier list like this again for at least a day. Yeah, you can have a promise of at least a day. There's not another tier list coming tomorrow. Don't expect it. But anyway, I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.